Grace and peace. I'm Brian Muster, the Baptist Campus Minister, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are continuing our discussion on the discipleship experience, how to use the spiritual disciplines to transform all of our lives into the image of Christ. And this is the third video in the 7th lesson, and we're talking about solitude. This idea of how being alone, being out of community, can help us actively engage well in community, can help us love our neighbor when we don't need our neighbor to provide for our own health, our own mental, internal well-being, it allows us to love our neighbor in a new way. Richard Foster says this in Celebration of Discipline, and this is a good place to start. The fear of being left alone petrifies people. Loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. But it's this idea that often we are so afraid of being alone that it changes how we are with people. We are desperate to be able to be included, to be able to be part of the group, that we are no longer willing to, out of fear, to be ourselves in that group. And we even kind of will isolate who we are from that group so that we can be included in that group. Solitude deals with this perpetual fear that some of us have of being alone. Of course, not all of us have this fear. Nathan Foster says this. This is going back to the previous video about confession, but this is interesting. Some people fantasize about having an affair. I fantasize about being a mountain hermit. So it's this idea, some of us are so afraid of being alone that we will always engage community, but we'll do it shallowly so that they will accept us. Others of us are so encouraged, or so okay, or so afraid of being with people that we seek isolation. And solitude helps us to truly balance between those two things, how to engage in community when we are there, but also not necessarily need community to define and identify our value and our worth. So, question for you, is being alone something you enjoy? Or is it something you fear? Why or why not? And that's not so much something that you can drop down in the comments and say, but if you want to, I will hear it and listen. But deal with that in your own heart. Being alone, is that something that you enjoy, something you fear, something you long for? Would you rather be alone? Do you not like people so much? Or is it just you don't like a lot of people? That's introverted. But there's a difference between isolated and introverted. But there's also a difference between being alone and being lonely. So, Jesus and solitude. And let's look at some of these verses. There's a good bit of Jesus being okay with being alone. And it was important to Jesus, his alone time. When Jesus heard about it, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when the crowds caught up to him, he actually took care of them and had compassion on him. But he sensed this peace of being alone. After dismissing the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Mark, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up, went out, and made his way to a deserted place, and he was praying there. Yet he often withdrew to deserted places and prayed. John, therefore, when Jesus knew that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. I want to point out that all four of the gospel writers mention something about Jesus being alone, being in the not around people. That makes it obvious that that was an important part of who Jesus was and how Jesus related to the earth. He was someone who would be there and have compassion on the crowds. He would be someone who engaged with his 12 disciples and his other closest followers. He was there with people so often. But each one of the gospel writers makes a point to point out that Jesus also went off at important times to pray and to be alone in a way that allowed him to re-engage in the communities even to a greater extent. Henry Nouwen says this, and Out of Solitude is a great book, but it's this using solitude or needing solitude to be in a place in our lives so that we can engage in community. Out of his solitude, Jesus reached out his caring hand to the people in need. In a lonely place, his care grew strong and mature, and from there he entered into a healing closeness with his fellow human beings. We can get alone so that we have the necessary resources within ourselves that is not community based, so that when we enter into a community with needs, we have some of ourselves that exists outside of the community to give and to put into the community. We can care for the community because we exist in spite of or in difference to the community, not in spite of. That sounds a little bit weird, but we exist separate from the community, even though we're in the community. So therefore we can invest in the community of the resources that we have that way. Bonhoeffer, let him who cannot be alone beware of the community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound pitfalls and perils. The one who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings, and the one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair. It's this idea that being alone helps us engage in community, and community keeps us from the perils and dangers of being alone and wrapped up entirely in and among ourselves. When was the last time you were truly alone? And this is something I have to ask these days. Bonhoeffer never had to ask this question, but digitally alone. Were there a bunch of people on your phone, or were you truly alone? What was that like? If you want to talk about it, drop down in the comments section and leave it. Was it a good thing? Was it a fearful thing? Have you been alone in a long time? And I mean alone, not just by yourself with your phone and 1,000 other people on the other end of that, but alone. So as we look at this, and being alone will help us engage in the context of community. So we can turn this, and these are some things to work on for the rest of the week. Share with a good Christian friend something that you are afraid of letting people know. Confession. Spend at least 4 consecutive hours alone without the internet at some point this week. Continue to practice one specific spiritual discipline every day this week to try and form that discipline as a habit. Again, that's kind of the homework. This one was a little bit shorter. This idea of solitude helps us engage in community, but also community is one of the things that allows solitude to truly be formative and not just selfish. Next week, we're looking at prayer and trying to put all these pieces together, how to integrate our heart, mind, soul, strength, and social context into a whole human being, into our identity, into our personhood. And prayer is the tool we'll use to do that with. How do we truly engage as entire human beings into the formation of becoming like Christ? So, as always, there are 3 ways to join: in person Sunday nights at 5, live Monday nights at 7, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube, and those links are in the descriptions below. I enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I hope it continues real soon.